The United States, dubbed the melting pot, is well known for its diversity on all accounts as represented in its population, and despite political or current events, there is no refutation to the fact that the exchange of different cultures played a major role in where America is today. But at the same time, America has struggled with maintaining equality on all accounts thanks to this history. And much like other countries, it's still facing the repercussions of that history even today. These issues could be attributed to the country's legal system that passed and supported laws and founding documents that perpetuated inequality. As a result, America has also had a history of combating discrimination, from the civil rights movement to challenging the court through legal action. But recently, the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic that has impacted regions all over the world particularly hit the United States in a number of ways. From the existing public health and safety threats to the decrease in employment, perhaps the most unexpected effect of this pandemic was the increase in hate crimes targeting Asian Americans.
New tonight, it's happened again. The Hate Crimes Unit investigates a brutal beating in Hell's Kitchen.
In the latest attack on an Asian New Yorker, a woman was heading to church when she was kicked to the sidewalk.
The Hate Crimes Task Force is investigating this attack on the J train.
It's really terrible how every single day there seems to be another incident.
This issue of Asian-based discrimination has always been prevalent throughout history, and it may even surprise you how much. To get a better understanding, it helps to understand the history Asian Americans had with the U.S. Constitution. Asians, mainly Chinese immigrants, first started immigrating to the U.S. around the mid-19th century due to a variety of factors, like the California gold rush at the time, and to get jobs working on the railroads. But the Chinese laborers were soon vilified, indicated by the first major act discriminating against Asian Americans, the Chinese Exclusion Act, in 1889. Congress also passed the Scott Act in 1888, which denied the re-entry of tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants abroad, even those who held official certificates guaranteeing their right to return. In the Supreme Court case Che Chan-ping v. U.S., the court defended the act, stating Congress was defending America against an Oriental invasion by revoking at will whatever residency permission previously was granted. You will start to notice a pattern of the courts defending Congress's discriminatory acts going forward as well, and this decision was the beginning of it all. In 1892, Congress passed the Geary Act, which created a registration requirement for all Chinese laborers. The court once again upheld this act, Fong Yu Ting v. U.S., stating that the power to deport was included in Congress's inherent power to exclude aliens, making it constitutional. In two other cases, Nishimura EQ v. U.S. and Yamataya v. Fisher, the court established Congress to have plenary power over immigration. One brighter spot in judicial jurisprudence history towards Asian Americans was in Wong Kim Ark v. U.S., where the courts finally recognized the 14th Amendment of citizenship to all immigrants, which included the Chinese. Asian Americans were also subject to discrimination regarding education. The court held in the case of Gong Yun v. Rice that a Chinese American girl could indeed be forced to attend the colored-only school on the grounds of Plessy v. Ferguson's separate but equal precedent. But it wasn't until 1943 when the Supreme Court made possible one of the most egregious decisions in U.S. history.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Anti-Asian American sentiment had been growing within the U.S. for years, but the war with Japan intensified the discrimination that Japanese Americans faced. During World War II, over 100,000 Americans were ordered to concentration camps for being ethnically Japanese. Rather than obey the order, 23-year-old Fred Korematsu sold his car, tore up his driver's license, and assumed a new identity in Berkeley, California.
In their landmark case, Korematsu v. U.S. At the time, America was still reeling from the Japanese Pearl Harbor attack, but in that period of fear, Americans could not seem to distinguish between their own citizens and the Japanese because they put over 120,000 people of Japanese descent in internment camps. and a young man named Fred Korematsu fled his home to risk being caught and taken away even after his whole family had already been taken. Korematsu was later caught and put in jail, and his lawyers made a case against the country, saying that the Equal Protection Clause had been violated. They appealed twice and finally took their case to the Supreme Court. But unfortunately, the court upheld Korematsu's conviction in a 6-3 majority. In his majority statement, Justice Hugo Black wrote that although all legal restrictions which curtailed the civil rights of a single racial group are immediately suspect and subject to tests of the most rigid scrutiny, not all such restrictions are inherently unconstitutional. In other words, because the courts felt that it was a risk to national safety, the internment camps were justifiable and constitutional. In his dissent statement, Justice Robert Jackson felt that the nation's wartime security concerns were not adequate nor justifiable enough to strip Korematsu and other internees of their constitutionally protected civil rights and liberties. And Justice Frank Murphy dissented as well, calling the majority decision a fall into the ugly abyss of racism.
No, I wasn't, because I didn't feel that I did anything wrong. If anybody did it wrong, it was the law.
Korematsu v. U.S. stands as one of the biggest mistakes of the Supreme Court, made right next to Plessy v. Ferguson. Nearly 4 decades later, the case was looked at once again and deemed unconstitutional. By continually upholding the lower court's decisions regarding constitutional violations against Asian Americans, the courts ultimately failed to condemn Asian hate crimes, and it was reflected in the number of hate crimes that continued and even spiked outside of the courtroom. This can be evidenced throughout American history, not just during World War I with Pearl Harbor. Even in the late 1800s, Chinese immigrants in Los Angeles faced heavy discrimination and hostility, where they were roughly 3% of the population at the time. Press coverage towards the Chinese quickly turned more intolerant, xenophobic, and hateful, as newspapers such as the Los Angeles Star ran editorials condemning immigration and slandering the Chinese, which in turn resulted in an increase in racially motivated attacks towards the Chinese. This manifested in October of 1871, when a feud in Chinatown led to the kidnapping of a young Chinese woman. This resulted in a shootout where an officer was wounded, and a civilian named Robert Thompson, who assisted the officers in arriving, was killed. Word quickly spread that Thompson was killed by the Chinese, and before long, a mob of 500 rioters dragged innocent Chinese residents to the gallows and hung 18 of them. The exact number of the victims was not documented, but at least 10% of the Los Angeles Chinese population had been killed that day. Though a grand jury returned 25 indictments for the murder of the Chinese, only 10 men stood trial. 8 rioters were convicted on manslaughter charges, but the charges were overturned on a legal technicality, and the defendants were never retried. This brutal and horrific incident, dubbed the Chinese Massacre, was quickly forgotten in Los Angeles history, and anti-Chinese sentiment only continued to rise. Truthfully, little changed since then, and only continued to escalate, where more incidents such as these were silenced from the media. Following the infamous 9/11 attacks, hate crimes against Muslim Americans rose. The media played a big role in fueling the xenophobic and fearful sentiment in many Americans following these attacks. In Milwaukee, in 2012, a Sikh temple was serving lunches worshippers after prayers when an armed gunman walked in and started firing. 6 people were killed and 3 others were wounded in plain daylight. The shooting reverberated throughout the region, and even in India, where the religion was founded, and where many victims' loved ones resided. Statements expressing sorrow and condemning the shooter came from President Obama and the then Republican challenger Mitt Romney. But many of the members of the temple claimed they lost their sense of security after the shooting. Some even stated that they felt they were being targeted, possibly because they were mistaken for being Muslim, but that didn't change the fact that it was a hate crime nonetheless. Things got so bad that Representative Joseph Crowley, Democrat of New York and co-chairman of the Congressional Caucus on Indians and Indian Americans, sent a letter to Attorney General Eric H. Holder Jr., urging the FBI to collect data on hate crimes committed against Asian Americans. In the previous year alone, among South Asians, he said in the letter, 2 Sikh men in a Sacramento suburb were slain, a Sikh temple in Michigan was vandalized, and a Sikh man was beaten in New York. But today, the hate crimes still continue, and out of an unprecedented circumstance and rate. The coronavirus, which has originated in Wuhan, China, has spread all around the world, and several countries such as the United States have been hit hard by it. But as the pandemic rose, hateful rhetoric began to rise as well amongst the general public. At the start of the pandemic in the US, the FBI warned the public that it expected a surge of hate crimes against those of Asian American and Pacific Islander descent. And they were right. According to NBC News, since 2020, Asian hate, which has been reported, increased by nearly 150% in Los Angeles and New York, respectively. The overall hate crimes rate decreased, while the one specifically targeting Asian Americans increased. And according to Karthik Ramakrishnan, the founder and director of AAPI Data, the Trump administration's racist rhetoric towards the virus helped and played a role in fostering more hate. What Trump did is that he weaponized it in a way, Ramakrishnan said. Trump's rhetoric helps set a certain narrative in place, and presidents have an outsized role in terms of shaping the narrative. This is one of the main reasons why healthcare professionals recommend using the name by what other professionals have named it, like COVID-19, to avoid identification of the virus to a certain country. Whatever it may be, there's no doubt that the conversation surrounding the origin of the virus has become increasingly toxic, hateful, and surprisingly normalized, considering the rhetoric it's based upon. But it's no surprise that the normalization of such conversations to the point where they're tossed out as jokes has played a role and contributed to the increase in Asian American hate crimes. As recent as February of 2020, an 84-year-old Thai man by the name of Vicha Ratanapakdee was attacked in broad daylight. The attacker, 19-year-old Antoine Watson, came barreling towards him when he was walking outside and slammed him to the ground. Ratanapakdee passed away in the hospital 2 days later. Surveillance footage of the incident was released, and according to Ratanapakdee's stepson Eric Lawson, if you see the video, there's nothing non-intentional about it. For him to come from all the way across the street, what else could have motivated him? Lawson and his wife, who claims she has experienced several anti-Asian verbal attacks since the start of the pandemic, believe the attack was racially motivated. And sadly, as I was preparing to make this video, yet another horrific incident occurred, specifically on March 16th of 2020, when a 21-year-old male entered 3 different Atlanta spas and shot 8 women, 6 of whom were Asian.
This is truly horrifying. 8 people dead, 6 of them Asian women. And soon we'll learn all about them and who they were in life, but all we know right now is that they are dead, and a 21-year-old white man with a gun killed them.
This random act of mass murder might have seemed very bizarre to many, but with the number of Asian hate crimes rising in America, many should have seen it coming, frankly. Perhaps the strangest part of the aftermath following the shootings was when Cherokee County Sheriff Captain Jay Baker described the suspect who murdered 8 individuals as, quote, having a bad day.
And he was pretty much fed up at the end of his rope, and yesterday was a really bad day for him, and this is what he did.
Where you see the police officer come out and almost trying to humanize the shooter more than the people who got shot. He was at the end of his rope. It was a bad day for him. For him? Yo, yesterday was a bad day for him? No, yesterday was a bad day for all the people who lost their lives.
Throughout his statement to the press, Baker's rhetoric was surprisingly nonchalant, and his description of the suspect's acts offended many people around the country, including what many considered a justification to Long's actions, saying he was at the end of his rope. Backlash spread further when a recently surfaced Facebook post, which appeared to be from the captain's old account, displayed, "Place your order while they last," with a smiley emoji next to an image of t-shirts for sale that read, COVID-19 imported from China. Since the shootings and the aftermath surrounding it, widespread sentiment from the public echoed the conviction of Long's crime as a hate crime. But it's extremely difficult to identify a crime as a hate crime, as the motive needs to be clear and several factors go into play from a law enforcement perspective. In Long's case, he claimed the shootings were not racially motivated. In the wake of the coronavirus, so much has happened, but the violence towards Asians, although unprecedented, was louder than ever. These events have prompted the call for a new bill to take action, and lawmakers in Massachusetts to push a bill they say would further expand and clarify hate crime laws, as well as taking two existing and adding gender and immigration status as protected classes when determining if a hate crime has been committed. According to a co-sponsor and state representative, Tram 1, the Atlanta attacks were a major catalyst for pushing this bill. The rise in anti-Asian hate incidents did not come out of nowhere. There have been a long and troubling history of racism and discrimination, one said. Ask any Asian person, and I'm sure most of us will have stories to tell you about being ridiculed for the way we look. The Senate co-sponsor of the bill, Democratic Senator Adam Hines, says the bill is not about creating new laws, but reforming the existing hate crime laws already in the books. Besides adding gender and immigration status as protected classes, the bill seeks to make sentencing proportional to actions, strengthen penalties for repeat offenders, and clarify that bias has to be a contributing factor for the hate crime statute to kick in. On March 18th, the House Judiciary Committee also held hearings on violence on Asian Americans, with several people of Asian descent speaking on the issue and demanding judicial and legislative action on anti-Asian hate. There's a quote from a famous writer, Toni Morrison, who said, the very serious function of racism is a distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It really is the red flag that the troubadour dances before the head of a bull. Its purpose, to keep the bull's mind away from his power and his energy. But unfortunately, this brutal, random, and unprovoked incident was not isolated. There have been so many documented incidents and police reports filed in response to attacks on Asian Americans since the start of the pandemic that it's so hard to document the ones that weren't reported. This indicates that the numbers are likely grossly underreported. But throughout history, that seems to have been the pattern. Asian American hate crimes and discrimination have been prevalent, as we have seen, yet it has not really been at the forefront of any conversation until very recent times with the pandemic. At times like these, it's important to reflect on the changes throughout the years and the progress we as a nation made. Significant legislative and judicial amendments were made as time went on, and cases continued to be challenged, much like the civil rights of African Americans. But something interesting to note with Asian American discrimination and violence on their civil liberties was how the climate shaped this spike in hate and discrimination. Racism in America against Asian immigrants was always prevalent, as we have seen before. But it's not difficult to notice that whenever an event occurs that raises fear and panic, hate is always targeted to a certain group. This can be evidenced during World War I with the Japanese internment camps, and even why the court failed to deem them constitutional. Coincidentally, Justice Black's rationale for upholding the constitutionality in the internment camps was almost the same logic used to justify the Muslim ban by then-President Trump. Even the pandemic has obviously brought out a large spike in hatred towards Asian Americans, hence the hate crimes. At a time like this, it's important to be mindful of the climate of the country, because one second a group can be part of the nation, and the next they will be looked down at as aliens and betrayed. As the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg once said, "A court ought not be affected by the weather of the day, but by the climate of the era." As Americans, we can take comfort in the fact that although this country has a dark history, change occurs, and history is ultimately reshaped by those determined to call this place home.